I found tampons in my husband's car. I wished he had been unfaithful to me instead, so that my kids wouldn't have had to go through this. I am a 29-year-old female who has been with my 30-year-old husband for 7 years, married for 4. I've never had reason to suspect he was unfaithful to me or even remotely dissatisfied with our marriage. He likes to joke that we're still living the honeymoon phase. Nearly 5 years and 2 kids in. I wouldn't have questioned that or him were it not for a surprise I found in his car last month when buckling our daughter into her car seat. I noticed something slotted between the cushions. At first, I thought it was just some stray toy or snack wrapper, so I reached down to fish it out. As my fingers closed around the object, I felt the familiar cylindrical shape of a tampon. Confusion washed over me as I pulled it into view, the bright wrapper stark against the upholstery. This wouldn't have been so unusual had I not had an IUD that had stopped my period for the past year, and I didn't even recognize the wrapper style. It was a brand I never used. A small but glaring discrepancy that made my stomach churn. I brought it to my husband's attention later that evening, still holding the offending item like it was evidence in a mystery I was desperate to solve. He didn't seem to understand what it was at first, staring at the tampon in my hand with genuine confusion. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked, his brow furrowing. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I found it in your car between the cushions. And it's not mine. I haven't had a period in over a year. Remember?" His face remained blank for a moment longer before realization dawned. He shrugged and said it probably belonged to his coworker Fiona. His initial confusion quickly gave way to dismissiveness as he waved off my concerns with a nonchalant explanation. "Probably Fiona's," he said with a shrug. Turning back to his phone. "She must have dropped it when we went out for lunch the other day." I stared at him, waiting for a sign that he understood why this was bothering me. But there was nothing. No apology, no concern. Just a casual dismissal. It was as if the tampon was no big deal. And I was overreacting. His indifference felt like a slap in the face, leaving me reeling and questioning everything I thought I knew about our marriage. It's not uncommon for my husband to carpool to lunch with his coworkers, and we're both fairly close to Fiona and her husband. The thought of my husband carpooling with Fiona and her husband had always been a non-issue. They were friends, after all, and it wasn't uncommon for them to share rides to lunch. In fact, we often socialized as couples spending weekends at each other's houses for barbecues or movie nights. Fiona and I had even bonded over shared experiences like the challenges of balancing work and family life. Our kids played together while we chatted about everything from the latest office gossip to more personal topics. It made sense, considering how often they carpooled. I reassured myself that the tampon could have easily slipped out of Fiona's purse during one of these outings. No big deal. Maybe it fell out when she was grabbing her phone or wallet, getting jostled around in the process. No big deal, right? It was just one of those little accidents that could happen to anyone. I brushed it off as a harmless mistake, convincing myself there was no need to worry. After all, our friendship with Fiona and her husband was solid, built on years of trust and shared experiences. There was no reason to suspect anything out of the ordinary, so I pushed the unsettling discovery to the back of my mind, determined not to let a small, easily explained incident cause unnecessary drama. I put it out of my mind until we had dinner with Fiona and her husband a couple of weeks later. I had sincerely wanted to believe my husband. I just couldn't get over the way it had been tucked in the seat, and how my husband had seemed not to have any regard for it whatsoever. Maybe playing dumb? I don't know. I did something that I now feel kind of crazy for doing. I faked an emergency and asked Fiona if she had any tampons while we were out together. She handed me one almost identical to the tampon I'd found in our back seat, and I breathed a sigh of relief. So the tampon there was probably the same tampon here. And in all likelihood, there was an innocent explanation as to why it had been left in the back seat in the first place. I thought I'd seen the last of the out-of-place feminine hygiene products until I found another tampon this morning. This time in my sock drawer. I feel physically ill at the thought of my husband having an affair, and even more nauseated at the thought that the woman might have left these tampons out for me to find if it was my husband's coworker. Why would you give herself away by offering me one the other night? In any other situation, I would want to talk to my husband about this, but I feel too sick and embarrassed to approach him with what I found. Contemplating every possible source of 2 tampons has been my personal hell for the past few weeks. But I wanted to share an update. Shortly after posting here, I told my sister what happened. The tampon in the back seat in the sock drawer. My husband's cluelessness, the tampon from Fiona, and all the things I suspected but didn't want to believe. We compared tampons, say, for the back seat, one I had already discarded, and they were a match, just in different absorbency. I hadn't left either in a place where my husband or daughters would have found them and moved them around. My daughters didn't know what they were or where they had come from. My sister was convinced it was Fiona either puking, my husband fucking with me, or both. Direct confrontation of either party still seemed like a bad idea. So she suggested inviting Fiona and her husband over for our Labor Day barbecue. Unfortunately, they already had plans. My sister and I agreed that it was too soon for cameras without any other evidence, so it was just a waiting game from there, watching my husband for any changed behavior. There was none. Our house for any misplaced foreign items. There were none. And even the girls, for any new friends they might have met. My sister's husband was adamant on this last point, and partly why he was inclined to believe that the tampons were harmless. If anything had been happening in or around our home, he said, it would be nearly impossible to keep it from me and the girls, since my husband was the one taking them to and from daycare and most other activities during the week. I felt a good bit of consolation in that it wasn't until my younger daughter, 2yo, came down with something last week that I felt any differently. I wanted to be the one home taking care of her. But my husband insisted that I stay at work while he stayed home with her. I was okay with that. My sister and her husband figured it was a good sign that he would take the time off at a moment's notice, and at that point, we were all already beginning to put the tampon fiasco behind us. By the third or fourth day, I was just happy to see a near-healthy child and a husband who was helping see her through it. Toward the end of that week, though, I came home to something strange. The toddler that I'd left that morning in an old PJ set was now dressed in a onesie I'd never seen before, with a tiny clip in her hair. I can't say I have the sharpest memory, but I have a pretty good sense of what my kids wear on a day-to-day basis, and particularly what kinds of clothes they wear. I'd sworn off the full-length sleep suits with snaps across the front long before we'd ever had our second. The long snaps are just a pain in the ass and a no-go for efficient diaper changes, IMO. It's just not something I would dress her in, and my husband knows as much. He doesn't plan for or buy the girls' clothes, and he certainly doesn't accessorize them. So I was bewildered and kind of floored at the thought of someone around our sick child without my knowledge. I didn't think twice, and I went straight to my husband to ask if anyone had been over to see him or the girls. He seemed confused like before and asked me why I would think that it had just been him and the kids all day. I asked him again if someone had so much as stopped by to say hello, and he denied it. He told me to calm down. I might have lashed out and come forward with the accusations right then and there, but our older daughter was in the room and she sensed something was up. In a calmer voice, I asked him a third time if anyone had been around our children, and my husband swore that the girls hadn't been around anyone but him. He also denied buying new clothes or doing anyone's hair. With our daughter in the room. And my emotions all over the place. I decided to leave it. I couldn't make sense of it then, and it hardly seems clearer now. After I've driven myself half crazy with explanations that aren't adding up after nearly losing my mind over a hair clip and a onesie, I realized I wasn't getting anywhere with the accusations and half-baked guesswork. I'd gotten so absorbed in the paranoia and misery of my situation that I wasn't sleeping, eating, or caring for my kids the way I should have been. And I wasn't getting any answers. So I decided to pull the trigger on the hidden cameras and have them shipped to my sister's house, with my brother-in-law agreeing to help with the install setup over at mine. Before the cameras were ever delivered, though, I got my long-awaited confirmation last week. The day began like any other weekday morning in our bustling household. My husband and I rushed around trying to corral our two energetic daughters into their school uniforms. All while attempting to grab a quick bite to eat ourselves. Despite the chaos, there was a sense of camaraderie in the air, as if we were all in this hectic dance together. Once the girls were dropped off at school, my husband and I went about our respective workdays, counting down the hours until we could reunite with our little ones. But there was a strange feeling that I couldn't shake off, no matter how hard I tried, and it only intensified when I received a notification on my phone while at work. A Ring notification machine at the front door. I clicked on the video clip, half expecting to see the usual delivery person or neighbor passing by, but what I saw left me stunned. There on my doorstep was a young woman leading my daughter into the house, hand in hand, with my husband and other daughter close behind them. My heart hammered in my chest as I watched, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The girls were supposed to be in daycare and my husband was at work. The woman, as far as I knew, was living 2 states away with a court order keeping her there. Yet here she was, in our home with my husband and children. A wave of panic washed over me as I scrambled to make sense of the situation. Was this some kind of mistake, a misunderstanding, or was there something more sinister at play? I felt a knot form in the pit of my stomach as I realized that the answers to my questions might be far more troubling than I ever could have imagined. I stared at the screen in disbelief. The blood pounding in my ears as I watched the unthinkable unfold before my eyes. There, on the footage captured by our Ring doorbell, was a scene straight out of a nightmare. A woman I hadn't seen in years leading my youngest daughter into our home, hand in hand with my husband and older daughter trailing behind them. The shock of the moment rendered me momentarily speechless. How could this be happening? The girls were supposed to be at daycare and my husband at work. Yet here they were, entering our house with a woman I never thought I'd see again. My sister-in-law. My initial reaction was one of sheer disbelief. A desperate hope that there must be some kind of mistake, some innocent explanation for what I was witnessing. But as the reality of the situation sank in, a wave of anger surged through me like a tidal wave, threatening to consume everything in its path. With trembling fingers, I reached for my phone, my heart pounding in my chest as I dialed my husband's number. I needed answers, and I needed them now. But as the phone rang on the other end, there was no response. I immediately called my husband to ask him what the fuck this woman was doing in our house. He didn't answer, so I texted it to him. Even in his stupidity, he probably realized he had messed up by going through the front door. Knew I had gotten the Ring notification and wanted to delay the inevitable. By the 5th or 6th subsequent call, though, he did pick up. The woman on the camera was my husband's sister. As I would come to find out later, she was the likely source of both tampons, the onesie, and the bow. She is also registered as an individual with a history of abuse, and a recovering addict who spent the better part of her adolescence and young adulthood coercing the silence of another one of my husband's family members after she had abused them. I hadn't seen or heard from her in years, and from the way my husband talked about her, I didn't expect I ever would. But here she was, in our house with our children. It wasn't just the shock of seeing her after years of silence that left me reeling. It was the realization of what her presence in our home meant. My sister-in-law, fresh off another stint in rehab, was the last person I expected to find sneaking into our lives, especially under such clandestine circumstances. The gravity of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't about a random tampon or a harmless mistake. It was about deception and betrayal at the deepest level. Suffice to say, I was livid. It wasn't an affair at all, and still somehow infinitely more disgusting. Knowing who it was and why all of this had been happening. Apparently, my sister-in-law had wanted to reconnect and make amends with people she'd hurt, and my husband was high on that list. The irony of her attempts at reconciliation through deceit and intrusion was not lost on me. My husband didn't want me to know, or worse, try to keep her family, our children, away from her. So they'd been meeting in secret often at our house when I was at work. They would enter through the garage in my husband's car, so the Ring camera at the front door wouldn't tip me off. The level of planning and secrecy involved made my skin crawl. She spent the night on a weekend. I had been on a business trip and slept in our bed. The very thought of her in our home, in our bed, made me feel violated. She babysat our girls on a night. My husband told me he had dropped them off at his parents', the casual way he had lied to me. The ease with which he had kept this secret made me question everything I thought I knew about him. She bought the girls clothes and dressed my youngest in the onesie and bow that my husband had promised in his life. I had dressed her in myself. The image of my daughter in that unfamiliar outfit, a tiny clip in her hair, now felt like a haunting reminder of the betrayal that had been unfolding right under my nose. And yet, when I turned to my husband for reassurance, for a glimmer of hope in the face of uncertainty, all I found was disbelief and denial. He brushed off my concerns with a casual shrug, insisting that it was all in my head, that I was overreacting to a series of harmless coincidences. My husband swore this was all in my head: the tampons, the onesie, the bow, and all the rest. He was perfectly content to watch me agonize for weeks over a woman he insisted didn't exist. Shrugging off each progressively more unsettling discovery like it was news to him and telling me I was being irrational, he insinuated that I was experiencing postpartum depression 2 years after I'd given birth. For years later, I told him that one of my biggest fears for motherhood was to suffer from PPD, like my mother had with me, to not be fully present for our babies and be left with a world of guilt and regret as they grew older. But as the weeks stretched into months and the truth remained stubbornly elusive, my patience wore thin, replaced by a simmering rage that threatened to consume me whole. How could he dismiss my fears so callously to gaslight me into doubting my own sanity? How could he stand idly by as our family teetered on the brink of collapse? He told me I wasn't sleeping enough, that I missed the girls too much, that I needed to take a step back and reevaluate the state of my mental health. I gave him the benefit of the doubt because he was my husband, and because no other version of events made sense. Now, after a month of this mindfuck, I have nothing to show for my trust, for this pathetic situation, and a lot of anger. My husband failed to explain himself. When confronted, he stammered and stumbled over his words, offering half-hearted excuses that made no sense. He muttered something about trying to protect me from unnecessary stress about his sister, just wanting to make amends. But his words were disjointed and unconvincing. Each excuse was more implausible than the last. A desperate attempt to cover up the truth. His evasiveness only confirmed my worst fears. The man I had trusted and built a life with was now a stranger to me, hiding behind a facade of lies and deceit. I watched as he avoided eye contact. His shoulders slumped in defeat. The weight of his betrayal hung heavily in the air, a palpable presence that neither of us could ignore. There was no reasonable explanation for his actions or for the deceit. Annotated our marriage. Every time he opened his mouth, I could see the panic in his eyes. The realization that he had been caught and there was no way out. His silence on certain points spoke louder than any words ever could, revealing the depth of his dishonesty. I knew then that I couldn't stay with someone who had so blatantly betrayed my trust and jeopardized the safety of our children. The thought of my daughters being exposed to such toxic secrecy and manipulation was unbearable. I had to prioritize their well-being, and that meant making the hardest decision of my life with a heavy heart. I told him it was over. The look of shock and desperation on his face was almost pitiable, but it couldn't erase the damage that had been done. I walked away, determined to protect my children from any further harm. I decided to end the relationship and file for divorce. The decision was both heartbreaking and empowering. It was devastating to acknowledge that our 7-year journey together had come to such a bitter end. But it was also liberating to take control of my life and prioritize my well-being and that of my children. The divorce process was long and grueling. Each step felt like a new battle in an endless war. There were countless court sessions, each more draining than the last, where I had to relive the pain and betrayal over and over again. My husband fought me every step of the way, refusing to accept responsibility for his actions and attempting to paint himself as the victim. His determination to contest every detail made the process even more exhausting and emotionally taxing. In court, I detailed the discovery of the tampons, the hidden meetings with my sister-in-law, and the lies my husband had told to cover his tracks. I showed the Ring footage, which captured her entering our home with my children, and provided testimonies from my sister and brother-in-law to corroborate my claims. However, the court needed more than assumptions about my sister-in-law's character. They required concrete evidence of her past and present behavior, which was not easy to obtain. Despite these challenges, I remained focused on the bigger picture. I emphasized my husband's deceit and the breach of trust, which were undeniable. The court recognized the complexity of the situation and the emotional turmoil it had caused. After months of legal battles and countless court sessions, the court ruled in my favor. I was granted primary custody of our daughters, with my husband receiving supervised visitation rights. The judge acknowledged the need for a stable environment for the children, considering the deceit and the potential risks involved. Looking back, this ordeal taught me several valuable lessons that I hope others can learn from. Trust is the foundation of any relationship, and once it's broken, it's incredibly difficult to rebuild. Always listen to your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Communication is key. Address issues head-on rather than letting them fester. Most importantly, never settle for less than you deserve. My children and I deserve a life free from deception and betrayal, and I am committed to building that future for us. In your opinion, what do you think about this story? Please leave your comment below to let me know.